I would add academia and much of the folks involved in the government, they would argue, well, you could have owned stocks and real estate during that 90 to 97% loss of purchasing power, lifetime savings. At the end of the day, we're finding now, past 10 years, stocks and real estate have not held up the way they had traditionally. And that is no longer this sort of safe haven people had grown to expect them to be. I'd like to delve a bit further into this partnership between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department that you cover so well in The Creature from Jekyll Island. You know, when Congress needs funds, they don't simply print up dollars. As I understand it, they first contact the Treasury, who then contacts the Fed. The Fed issues notes, which the Treasury then sells on the market in exchange for funding. But the process has one big Achilles heel. Unlike Canada's central bank, for instance, which is, as I believe, owned by the people and bears little to no interest, the Fed is privately owned and, like a parasite, extracts a heavy tribute on the typical American in the form of taxes. Not only is the process unethical, but it's highly unconstitutional. Would you like to fill in the blanks here?
Yes, I think that's an interesting point you've raised about the central bank being allegedly owned by the people. I use the word allegedly for reasons I hope to make clear in a moment here. It's like so many things that are owned by the people. People really have no control or voice over it. They just own it in theory only. I mean, there are a lot of places in the United States, for example, where there are wilderness areas and public lands and BLM lands. Well, they're technically owned by the people, but when you go to look at them, there are signs all over the place that say, do not enter. Government land, keep off. And supposedly a lot of these enterprises owned by the federal government it means they're owned by the people. It means you and I own them. Okay, let's decide that we want to sell our shares. Wow. Well, no, we don't have shares. It's just a trick. It's a phrase. It's not really owned by the people at all. It's owned by the state, which means it's controlled by the politicians and the bureaucrats, and the people are told to keep them happy that they own it. But the fact of the matter is that the Federal Reserve System in the United States is not an awful lot different from that in Canada. You mentioned the tremendous interest that the Fed earns. Well, in reality, the Federal Reserve System, remember, is not a bank. You and I don't go to the Fed and get money or deposit money or borrow money or anything. Basically, the Fed is nothing but an organization. It's a network of banks. It's a cartel, in other words, just like the OPEC. OPEC, it doesn't produce any oil, but the members of OPEC produce the oil. And so OPEC is merely a cartel. It's an agreement. It's a little. They have an administrative staff to administer the agreements between the member countries, the oil-producing countries. Well, the Fed is the same. It's not really a bank. Doesn't loan money, and to the average person, it's a network of banks. It's a cartel, and so the only money it creates at interest is what it loans to the federal government. And that's by agreement in the very beginning. And it does loan money to the federal government, and it does charge interest on it. So far, that's what you've said is true, tremendous amount of interest. But now, what people often miss is that interest, what is not used to operate the cartel itself, the Federal Reserve System itself, whatever interest is above and beyond that is returned to the Treasury. So it's really kind of like a nonprofit organization. It doesn't really make any profit from the interest it collects on the loans created out of nothing for the federal government. It does, however, get the taxpayers, you and I, does get the government to pay for all of its overhead, which is not too bad. Here's a cartel. If you can imagine a banana cartel or a sugar cartel, getting the taxpayers to pay for the total cost of their overhead, but then anything over and above that is returned. The real action is not at the Federal Reserve level where it loans money to the federal government. It's in the private banking sector. You see, those are the people that own the Fed. The private banks own the Fed. The private banks direct the Fed. The private banks are really the ones that we ought to be looking at, not the Fed itself. And so the real money, interest on nothing, is created at the private bank level, the commercial bank level. And it's charged on interest that you and I, loans that you and I make or that corporations make. And the amount of money created there is often ignored because people are focused on the interest being charged at the Federal Reserve level. That's not really where the action is. The action is at the commercial bank level. So when you factor those elements into it, you'll find that our system and the Canadian system are really essentially the same.
You know, I also wanted to address the fact that these private banks who own shares, now, of course, they're not publicly traded, they're privately exchanged shares in the Federal Reserve. There are several sources which now claim that the Federal Reserve is owned by a cartel, if you will, of maybe 300 or so wealthy individuals. And even if that's just conspiracy theory hype or urban legend, the fact remains that these shares do exist. In other words, the United States or the American taxpayer certainly does not own the Federal Reserve. The head of the Treasury Department, they are not elected individuals. They are, of course, appointed. The argument is, well, if we allowed the taxpayer to elect the Federal Reserve Board, they would obviously just vote into the folks who gave them the most goodies. What are your thoughts on the fact that the Fed controlled through private shares and the members are appointed, not elected?
Well, I think there's a lot of illusion going on there, as there is for so many things, important things in Washington. This, I think, is one of the greatest illusions of all. The idea that the member banks control the Federal Reserve System because they have shares. Well, they do have shares, so far so good. But when you look at the shares, you find out that they do not carry the usual characteristics of they don't carry voting rights. As we've said before, if the banks really own those shares, they ought to be able to sell them. But they can't, so they don't own them. And the amount of money involved is very minimal. It's just to put up some kind of little bit of money as an asset. It's more for bookkeeping and showmanship than anything else. The amount of money that the banks put up in reserve for these shares is minuscule. It's laughable. It has nothing to do with the major financial transactions of the system itself. The larger banks, the two or three larger banks, are the ones that dominate the Federal Reserve System simply because of their sheer size and their prominence in the marketplace. The New York Federal Reserve System is really the only one that counts. The others are there primarily for show, to make people think that there's some kind of a democratic distribution of control geographically around the country, and that's all nonsense. It's all controlled out of New York, and it's a very centralized thing. And the fact that the president technically appoints the chairman of the Fed with the approval of the Senate, that too is kind of a mirage, because, you know, I've never known of one case where the president appointed somebody to the Federal Reserve chairmanship where the president even knew the person prior to that. He certainly doesn't go to his personal address book and say, let's see, who among my friends am I going to appoint? No, he's given a list of people to choose from. Yeah, and this list is provided to him by very powerful forces, none of which are very well advertised. It probably comes from the Senate and congressional banking committees. It certainly comes from the big donors to the president's campaign.
Timothy Geithner come to mind, Larry Sumner's, and, of course, Ben Bernanke.
They're all bankers, and, none of these people that are appointed really represent the point of view that you and I hold. They all are very friendly to or part of the banking industry, part of the central banking concept. Otherwise, they wouldn't be appointed. So this business of popular control through the president, control of the Fed, is just mirage. It's nonsense. It's garbage. And yet most people buy into it because they want to. It sounds so nice, and it's comfortable. But the reality is that the president does not appoint the Federal Reserve chairman. It's the Federal Reserve chairman, or I should say the banks that nominate the Federal Reserve chairman. They themselves choose their own employee, and it's the banks that nominate the president. They're the ones who determine who gets the nomination for presidency at the Republican or Democrat conventions. You have to look behind the scenes. This is not conspiracy theory. This is fact. This is historical fact. Anybody that follows these events with any depth at all recognizes the truth of this.